Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Casting Through Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. We should like you to think carefully over these points. We should like your young men to ask their elders about them, and for you to decide that you ought to behave towards us as we have behaved towards you. Do not think the Corinthians are quiet in what they say, but in the event of war, all this is not in our interest. Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 68, The Powder Keg. Well, we are now on the eve of the Peloponnesian War, with us now exploring the immediate events that would lead to the breakout of this war. Though, to arrive at this point, we have travelled through the period in ancient Greek history known as the Pentakonta Teiatia, this being the roughly 50-year period between the Persian invasions and the Peloponnesian War. This period has been used to show how the situation that existed in Greece and the evolving events would lead to Athens and Sparta going to war, even though they had fought on the same side against Persia. Personally, I had found that most general histories of ancient Greece seemed to treat this period in passing, as the Greco-Persian Wars transitioned into the Peloponnesian War. For this reason, I set out with the intention of putting some more focus on this period, which I think I've achieved by devoting some 15 episodes to it. Along the way, I came across some excellent modern resources that did deal with this time period, and were of a great help. These were The Outbreak of the Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan, which is part of his 4-part volume on the Peloponnesian War, while, for a Spartan perspective and some thought-provoking ideas, Paul Ray's Sparta's First Attic War was also a great assistance. For this period, as I have pointed out, on a number of occasions saw us dealing with large chunks of time where it was hard to pin down what exactly was taking place. The chronology in many areas was also hard to know for certain, since even our main ancient source, Thucydides, was also treating this time as a summary before getting to his main focus of the Peloponnesian War. However, I feel we have done a pretty good job attempting to outline what was happening and how the situation in the Greek world had been changing. This saw us watch as the two most powerful city-states on the Greek mainland had gone from allies to enemies in just a short period after the Greek victory over Persia. For the most part, this had been tied up in the interests of both. The Persian threat had seen Athenian and Spartan interests align temporarily, though there had always existed some level of suspicion since archaic times. Once Persia was defeated, these other interests would come back to the forefront. For Athens, the Persian Wars had seen their influence in the Greek world increase greatly. They would now possess one of the largest navies in the Greek world, and would over some decades build what would become the Athenian Empire, with smaller city-states throughout the Aegean and other areas of the Greek world, that all had some shared level of interest. In history, the situation where a state gains more power and influence in areas where other great powers are already active, more often than not leads to conflict, and this is the situation we now find ourselves in within the ancient Greek world. For today's episode, we'll be starting our look at the events that would lead to these two great Greek powers going to war and dragging much of the Greek world along with them. This would not be some major event taking place in either Sparta or Athens, but it would take place away on a northern coastline along the Adriatic. For analogy, this situation would prove to be a powder keg just waiting for a spark. It is also at this point where we find Thucydides begin describing the events that would lead to the 30 Years' Peace being dissolved. He would give us one main reason for the Peloponnesian War breaking out: the growth of Athenian power, and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. Though he then turns to events that would see the conflict come about, where he starts off with the Epidamnus affaire. To refer to a powder keg waiting for a spark in a historical context is usually used when describing a volatile situation that won't take much for it to explode into something bigger. In terms of history, the most common example given for this analogy is that of the situation before World War I. The spark that would ignite the conflict would be lit in the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia. This would be through the active assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, This act wouldn't in itself see the Powder Keg explode, but tensions had existed in this region for decades, as both Russia and Austria had competing interests here. The assassination would be the spark needed to see these decades of built-up tensions finally released. As we all probably know, this event in a seemingly remote part of the world would end up seeing all the great European powers go to war that would turn out to be one of the deadliest conflicts to that point in history. We could probably find examples of this sort of thing taking place around a number of great conflicts in different points of history. However, we are focused on the ancient Greek world, and we too can find a powder keg situation occurring around one of the greatest conflicts during the ancient Greek times. The situation we are concerned with would take place at the polis of Epidamnus, far north on the Albanian coast, looking out over the Adriatic. The location of Epidamnus, however, was far out of the way of both Athens and Sparta, who would become the polis heading either side of the conflict. For Sparta, this region had no bearing on the interests within the Peloponnese, or their connections to other areas of Greece, while for Athens, during our look at their growth and influence over the past 15 episodes, we had never seen Epidamnus come into the equation. The only faint reason we could possibly see Athens' interests in the city was due to their trade connections to Italy, but even here, Epidamnus appears to be too far north for Athens to be concerned with it. Though, like the situation before World War I, it would be the events and then the indirect connections to the larger powers that would see a far larger and dangerous situation occur. So, to help us understand things as they unfold, we need to first get some background of Epidamnus. This should give us the required context moving forward. As we have said, the polis was located north of Greek lands on the coast of Albania, looking out over the Adriatic. This placed it in what's known as Illyrian lands, though it would be established as a Greek colony. This would take place during the last quarter of the 7th century BC, with colonists from the island of Corcyra heading out to settle it. Corcyra is also key in the unfolding of events that would take place. The island itself was a colony that had been established by Corinth, with a traditional date of 734 BC of its establishment, some 100 years before Epidamnus. Corcyra was located some 160 kilometres south of Epidamnus and just off the western shore from the most northern parts of ancient Greek lands. This expedition sent out by Corcyra to found Epidamnus would also see a small number of Corinthians and other Dorians involved, but on the balance of things, Epidamnus would be a Corcyraean colony. Even though the colony would be established away from Greek lands and within the lands of what they considered barbarians, it would end up flourishing and growing quite wealthy. It appears they would benefit from sea trade routes as well as land trade with the Illyrian tribes, where a peaceful coexistence had been maintained. It could also be that the colony had benefited from the displacement of other peoples within Greece. One such example is where Strabo talks of a large group of exiles fleeing Elis to the Illyrian coast. Epidamnus would have been a very likely location they would have settled, given that they had a Dorian background. If this was the case, it would have seen the population of the colony given a sudden injection. We find even though the polis was isolated geographically from Greek lands, it was still able to maintain a position within Greek culture. We find by the closing of the 6th century, the city was wealthy enough to produce a citizen that was able to enter and win the chariot race at the Olympic Games, and not only that, but dedicated a statue of himself to honour the achievement. With the city moving through its prosperous times, we would find that it would also encounter some social, economic and political challenges, as other cities within Greece had already seen. Like many other cities within the archaic times, Epidamnus was governed by an aristocracy, and would see some of the same conditions set in, leading to civil strife. We then find Thucydides telling us of how the polis would now descend into a position of feebleness after its long experience of growth. This, he tells us, would come about due to the rise of political factions and their fights with one another, where the civil strife was particularly bad, and would last for many years. While it also seems the neighbouring tribes around the city would take advantage of the weakened position of the city, going to war with them. This would see Epidamnus lose a considerable amount of power and leave it in a precarious position. The last act that would occur before Epidamnus would go seeking outside help, and in a way lighting the fuse, would be expelling those in the city that were in power. Thucydides tells us this was done by the people, but given what we know of occurring elsewhere in other cities with political instability, it seems likely other factions of the aristocratic class, or members of it who were not in power, probably enlisted the help of the people to help oust those in power. The result of this would see the exiles seek a common cause with the Illyrian tribes at war with the city, and would join in plundering the city by land and sea. This now saw Epidamnus at a point of crisis, and looked to those outside to help bring the city back under their control. They would first turn to their mother city, Corcyra, for this aid. Epidamnus, who was now argued to be under democratic control, would send ambassadors to the island of Corcyra to seek assistance. For simplicity's sake, we will refer to the different sides of Epidamnus as aristocrats and democrats. The democrats addressed the Corcyrian officials as suppliants in the Temple of Hera. They urged them not to look on and allow them to perish under the current situation, but to make up matters between them and the exiled aristocrats, and rid them of the war with the barbarians. What Thucydides presents here is a plea from the colony to its mother city, which was not that uncommon. We find that the request was to stabilise the situation around their polis in general terms, by reconciling the two parties and assisting in bringing the war with the Illyrian tribes to an end. There is no talk of asking Corcyra to intervene in the factional fighting that had been taking place. However, the pleas that the Democrats made would not be answered, and Corcyra would not get involved in matters around Epidamnus. Finding themselves at a loss by receiving no help from their mother city, they then turned to one place that most do when faced with uncertainty. The Democrats would seek advice from the gods and would send a delegation to the oracle at Delphi. The question they asked, hoping for guidance from Apollo, was if they should give their city over to the Corinthians as their founders and seek assistance from them. The response they received through the Pythia was that this was the action that they should take, and place themselves under Corinth's protection. Armed with this advice of the gods, the Epidamnus Democrats then travelled to Corinth to help save their city. In Corinth they would receive an audience with the Corinthians, where they would put their predicament to them and what they had received from the oracle at Delphi. One can imagine the closing arguments would have been pleading not to allow the city to perish. The Corinthians would agree to assist, where they had taken the view that Epidamnus was just as much a Corinthian colony as a Corcyrian one. A small group of the initial colonists had been from Corinth, with supposedly the leader of the expedition being a Corinthian. They felt it was their duty to assist and offer protection to those who had returned to their mother city seeking help. So, this leaves a question open of why Corcyra wouldn't help their colony. This would have surely given them some more influence within the city and the region. Thucydides, who's our main source, doesn't offer us any clues to the refusal of help. However, this has been a question that many scholars have pondered over. Donald Kagan, in his Outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, puts forward two explanations that have been cited. The first looks at the possibility that Corcyra was more aligned with the aristocratic elements of Epidamnus. This resting on the assumptions that the Corcyrians were related by blood to the aristocrats of Epidamnus, and Corcyra itself was an aristocracy. However, Kagan points out there is no hard evidence to support these assumptions, as they could have easily been related to members of the democratic faction also. While we know only a few years later Corcyra itself would be a democracy, and it is a little hard to assume this change in government would have occurred so quickly and without much fuss in the sources. The second explanation looks to plain self-interest. Perhaps Corcyra was looking for more influence in the city, seeing the most efficient way of gaining this was to allow both sides within the city to wear each other out. Then this would see Epidamnus in dire straits, leading to it becoming a Corcyrian protectorate. This suggestion does make some sense, as civil strife had been going on for many years, and Corcyra had not seen it necessary to step in. But again, we are just working from assumptions here, with a lack of evidence in the sources. Though the fact still remained that Corcyra had refused to step in and help, and now the Corinthians, who had also a connection to the city, decided they would. This would, as we will see, create tensions between Corinth and Corcyra. Corinth would now make preparations to send support to Epidamnus in the form of manpower. They would make it known that volunteer colonists were sought after. Those willing to come forward would see that the population of the polis would be stabilised, accounting for those who went into exile. In addition to this collection of colonists, Corinth would also assemble a force that could assist in the war with the Illyrians and garrison the city. The force that would march off would consist of men from their allies, Ambracia and Lucas, over on the west coast of Greece, while a number of Corinthians would also be involved. Now, I said this force would march, even though the quickest route to Epidamnus would be by sea. This was due to the fact that it appears Corinth knew their action would displease Corcyra. The sea route would see that Corcyra could potentially prevent their passage, as they would need to pass by the island. This would see that the Corinthians would march to another Corinthian colony, Apollonia, also on the west coast and just south of Epidamnus. From reading Thucydides' account of this, it comes across that Corinth was well aware of the fact that the action that they took would inflame tensions with Corcyra and potentially lead to a conflict. So the question arises, why was Corinth willing to risk conflict with Corcyra? One line of thinking places economic reasons at the forefront. Kagan points out that scholars have cited trade and silver mines in Illyria as motivations, though it has been difficult to determine how much trade and silver Corinth actually received from this region. There appears to be more evidence supporting that the main silver supply received in Corinth came from Spain. However, Kagan puts forward another reason that he appears to be much more in favour of. He goes quite into a lot of detail around this explanation, though I will try and sum up the main line of thinking. This heads back to the time of Corcyra's foundation by Corinth, who appears to have had the intention of setting up a colony for trade purposes, like with Syracuse. But with the success of these colonies, they grew in size and wealth, which would ultimately see them becoming more independent, and not reliant on their mother city. Corcyra by the mid-600s would be its own polis, and we even hear of them fighting Corinth in one of the first naval engagements between Greeks. The reason for this conflict is unknown, but many have assumed that overlapping interests were now starting to take place in the region. Corinth had been attempting to spread its influence, but in doing so created another powerful polis that looked to their own interests. Over time, there appears to have been periods where the two were on better terms, such as when Epidamnus was founded, though it seems the tensions between the two were never far away. So when it comes down to it, it appears the tension was in the competing interests the two had in the region, and attempting to project their power throughout. It appears that with the crisis around Epidamnus, Corinth had seen an opportunity to improve their position at Corcyra's expense. But like always, the sources are quiet on these reasons, so modern scholars have had to make their most educated guesses on thin lines of evidence existing across various works. Have you been enjoying the series and thinking of helping support the show in some way? Casting Through Ancient Greece is over on Patreon, where we have been providing supporters with monthly bonus episodes, where we look at past topics in more detail and isolation. So far, we have revisited the Bronze Age of Greece, looking at art, trade connections, warfare, and a number of other topics. We then advanced into the Archaic period, where we then spent some time exploring the little-known Lalatine War, the Olympic Games, and emergence of the hoplite and other areas. This then saw us turn to doing a 3-part series on the epic poet Homer, where we also explored the 2 epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are credited to him. Currently, we are exploring the developments of both Sparta and Athens in more detail. We have recently dealt with the origin myths of both Sparta and Athens, as well as looking at some of the early influential figures coming from both cities. Currently, we're exploring the institutions that would develop in both of these cities, with us having focused on the Spartan agoge and helot system, while in Athens we are looking at their political reforms through the restructure of tribes and the political mechanism of the ostracism. If you're interested in gaining access to these bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Not only will you get monthly bonus episodes, but you will receive early access, ad-free episodes, plus video series updates about what's been happening in the series and what is planned. Other options also include access to fully referenced transcripts of the series episodes, where members' questions are answered monthly via video. Alternatively, you can head to the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find the Patreon link, as well as other ways that help the series grow when clicking on the Support the Series button. Thank you for listening to the series, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you over on Patreon. The call for volunteers to head to Epidamnus had been a great success, with many men having signed up and a number of cities given aid in the form of money and equipment. Once all had converged on Apollonia, it was only a short journey the rest of the way to Epidamnus, where the settlers and garrisons would establish themselves. Corcyra would end up learning of Epidamnus seeking Corinth's aid, and the action Corinth now undertook. Previous to this, the exiled aristocrats from Epidamnus had come over to Corcyra to seek help in restoring them to their city. But, to this request, the Corcyrians had also turned a deaf ear. But now with Corinth in the region and Epidamnus now handed over to them, Corcyra would take immediate action. They would sail with 25 ships with more to follow, stopping outside Epidamnus. They had brought with them the exiled aristocrats, which they now seemed willing to place back in control of the city. An ultimatum was given to the Democrats inside Epidamnus to take back the exiles and expel the Corinthian garrison and settlers. To this, the Democrats ignored what had been demanded of them, where the Corcyrians took further measures. They had now gathered 40 ships off the coast and had also secured the services of the Illyrians in the region. With these forces around the city, they now issued a proclamation that all of those within the city, Epidamnian or foreigner, could choose to depart the city. Any who did not take this opportunity would be considered the enemy and would be treated as such. The garrison and all the others inside the city would refuse this offer, and Corcyraean forces would now turn to besieging the city. The situation would now begin to escalate as news of the developments in Epidamnus would make their way back to Corinth. Corinth would respond by assembling a larger force in what appears to be an effort at establishing a new colony at Epidamnus, not just reclaiming an old one. They would call for more volunteers and look to recruit a larger expedition, this time around with them offering all those that went would receive an equal share in the new colony. This has often led to many thinking this referred to the redistribution of land. The eagerness of Corinth's desire to send the largest expedition as possible can also be found in the provision where anyone who could not depart right away could reserve a spot within the colony and its benefits by paying a deposit of 50 drachmas. This would see that the additional funds could be collected for the expedition while also building somewhat of a second wave that could bolster the position of the initial settlers. This time around, a sea route would be favoured due to the numbers involved. For this, Corinth asked its allies to provide a convoy to protect the settlers on their journey. Many would answer this call, with the various cities putting up just under 40 ships for this task, while others had provided financial assistance. Corinth would also see that an initial 30 triremes would travel to Epidamnus and some 3,000 hoplites to provide military support once there. It is interesting to note that out of the 10 cities that Thucydides lists as assisting, only 2 were Corinthian colonies. This, I think, points to the influence Corinth had within Greece. The other cities were members of the Peloponnesian League, but as we know, members only had to swear an oath of alliance to Sparta. What is interesting here is that Sparta was not involved in any way. We are unsure if they were approached, though one would think even a token Spartan force would have given Corcyra something to think about. Perhaps Sparta did not agree with the action that Corinth was taking, this appearing to be the right line of thinking given what would follow. The knowledge of these additional preparations that were being made by Corinth would make their way to the Corcyraeans, who it appears had been caught off guard, not expecting Corinth to act in such an aggressive manner. They would send a delegation to both Sparta and Sicyon, seeking support to attempt to resolve the issue diplomatically. Envoys from both would accompany the Corcyraean officials to Corinth, where Corcyra would put forward the request that the garrison and the settlers be recalled, as Corinth had nothing to do with Epidamnus. However, if Corinth decided they had a claim to make on the city, the Corcyraeans were willing to put the matter to arbitration, or to the Oracle at Delphi. After this display of reasonable diplomacy, the Corcyraean officials then ended with a not-so-subtle threat. They would make it known that if Corinth failed to go along with these requests, Corcyra would be forced in seeking allies in areas they had no desire to seek them, the situation forcing their hand to against these traditional ties. All that were present would have had no doubt that the officials were speaking about approaching Athens for this assistance. A stalemate in the situation would now develop as Corinth responded that arbitration may be possible if Corcyra would break the siege of Epidamnus and pull its forces back. However, how sincere this proposal was is questionable, as Corinth didn't propose any sort of military withdrawal on their part. Corcyra would not agree to this based on the fact that Corinth would now be able to potentially move in more forces, strengthening their position. Corcyra then countered with the proposal that they would pull back their forces if Corinth would remove theirs from the city and remain in a state of armistice until a judgment could be passed. They even offered a compromise that if this was not acceptable, then both could leave their forces in place and enter into a truce until peace negotiations were agreed. It becomes very clear in Thucydides' account that Corcyra was attempting everything they could to try and end these tensions peacefully, after having perhaps misjudged how Corinth would respond to their initial movements. However, it also becomes clear that Corinth, even though providing counter-proposals, was not deterred from conflict developing. It is hard for us to know for certain why Corinth avoided bringing the situation to a peaceful conclusion. There was no shortage of opportunities, and Corcyra was almost bending over backwards to offer acceptable terms. We even saw Sparta was present to encourage for a peaceful resolution, though stopping short of supporting Corcyra. By this stage, Corinth had already assembled its forces, the fleet manned, and all its allies were ready to go. Perhaps we can even find parallels here with the mobilisation that had been taking place in the lead-up to hostilities for World War I. There appeared to be a point, with all the preparation that had taken place and how far along they were, not much was going to see conflict avoided. In the end, Corinth would not find any of Corcyra's proposals acceptable. They would declare war, and the forces assembled now set sail towards Epidamnus. The Corinthian force, consisting of 75 ships and 2,000 hoplites, made their way up the west coast of Greece. They would get as far as Actium, on the Embroiling Gulf, when a small boat approached which had a Corcyrian herald aboard. It seems Corcyra made one last-ditch effort to avoid conflict, with the herald urging the Corinthians not to attack. Meanwhile, Corcyra lay just to the north, and it was in the path of the advancing Corinthian force. Here they had assembled their fleet of 80 triremes and waited the outcome of the herald's mission, though its commanders must have known conflict was almost certain. Corinth would indeed reject the attempt of peace made by the herald, and when he returned to Corcyra, and the outcome known, the Corcyrian fleet now put out to sea towards the Corinthian fleet and formed a line of battle. The tensions between the two had now officially turned hot, with the fleets of the Corcyrians and Corinthians meeting in battle just south of Corcyra. What unfolded during the engagement, we don't know, but Thucydides reports the outcome. He would tell us the battle would be a decisive victory for the Corcyrians, with them destroying 15 Corinthian ships. We also hear that on the same day, the city of Epidamnus would be forced to surrender. This another example where ancient sources like to pair victories by a side taking place on the same day. These Corcyrian victories would see that at Epidamnus, all the foreign troops and settlers would be sold off as slaves, while the Corinthians there would be held as prisoners until a settlement could be made. After the naval engagement, which would be known as the Battle of Leukium, due to the Corcyrians setting up a trophy on the headlands of Leukium on Corcyra, the foreign prisoners taken would all be put to death, while the Corinthians were kept in custody. As for the surviving elements of the Corinthian fleet, they would turn and sail back to Corinth. A big reason for holding the Corinthians as prisoners was for the Corcyrians to keep negotiations open. However, even with the defeat at sea, Corinth was in no mood to come to a settlement, and were determined to get revenge. In the wake of their victory, and no peace settlement in sight, the Corcyrians looked to take advantage of their situation now that they had complete control of the seas around their region. They would now turn their focus to Corinthian allies and colonies in the area that had provided assistance to the Corinthian campaign. It seems Corcyra had given up on the idea of coming to a settlement with Corinth, as this action would have just seen Corinth more eager to get back into the field. This is precisely what would take place. By next summer, Corinth would assemble another fleet and an army, which would be sent north once again. The purpose of this force seems to have been to protect its allies from further Corcyrian attacks. The Corinthians would find themselves assisting a number of their allies along the western coast across from Corcyra, while the Corcyrians would once again assemble their fleet and army. No battle would take place this time around, with both sides just monitoring each other's movements. This standoff would last all summer, and as the campaigning season came to a close, many of the forces would retire to their home bases. It seems the standoff would continue on for 2 years after the Corinthian defeat. Corinth was looking to just defend their allies, while back at home they were making preparations for a larger force to make an offensive move against Corcyra. For this, more ships were needed, with it taking time to build these in large numbers, while they would need to recruit many more rowers to man these triremes. Corinth recognised that it wasn't just a large fleet that was needed, but men experienced in manning these ships and in naval tactics. This would see Corinth turn to the cities of Greece, offering generous terms to come and row in the fleet. Many from the Peloponnese would take up the offer, but it wasn't just those from cities within the Peloponnesian League that would join the Corinthian fleet. A number of men from cities from within the Athenian Empire would also sign up. With this activity taking place, there was no way that these preparations would remain secret. Corcyra was nervously watching developments, and in a position where they were neither a member of the Peloponnesian League or part of the Athenian Empire. Now though, seeing what was on the horizon, they decided to send a delegation to Athens to see if they could secure an alliance and support from their vast resources. This move by Corcyra was known by the Corinthians. Obviously, if Athens supported Corcyra, this would see the Corcyrian navy an even more formidable force than what had defeated the Corinthian navy 2 years earlier. Corinth was not within Athens' sphere of influence, but nonetheless, Corinth would also send a delegation to Athens to try and prevent Athenian support interfering in their upcoming campaign. This would see both the Corcyrian and Corinthian delegations in Athens at the same time. The arguments that they would put forward to Athens were not behind closed doors, but would be presented on the Pnyx, in front of all Athenian citizens that were present. This would then allow a vote on the course of action Athens would take, since all citizens were able to cast a vote. Thucydides presents much of what was presented by both sides, and although probably not accurate word for word, it is very likely he gets the general arguments put forward right. It would have been hard for him to put forward an altered history on the events so close to them taking place, with so many witnessing these speeches. Corcyra's main challenge at securing Athens' support was to convince a powerful city that this was in their best interests, even though they had no past alliance with them, nor had their interests extended into Corcyra's region. Their ambassadors would make no secret of this in their opening speech to the Athenians. Athenians, in a situation like this, it is right and proper that first of all certain points should be made clear. We have come to ask for your help, but cannot claim that this help is due to us because of any great service was have done to you in the past, or on the basis of any existing alliance. We must therefore convince you, first, that by giving us this help you will be acting in your own interests, or certainly not against your own interests. And then we must show that our gratitude can be depended upon. If, on all these points, you find our arguments unconvincing, we must not be surprised if our mission ends in failure. The delegates would first address the point of not having anything to do with Athens in the past. They would show how their policies of the past were not aligned with the situation they were now faced, and how it was contrary to their interests now. This, they would admit, made their seeking help now look inconsistent. They would also highlight the error in their past policies of neutrality. When highlighting this point, they would say, "Now we see it clearly, as a lack of foresight, and as a point of weakness." They would then move on to showing how giving Corcyra assistance would be in Athens' interests. The first point made was that in doing so, they would be seen to be acting on the side of a victim against an aggressor. Further to this, Athens would have their undying gratitude, this being of a city with a great navy, and only second to the Athenians. This point being to highlight Athens' interests in maintaining naval supremacy in the Greek world and putting them in a stronger position than they were currently. They would then really hit home with this point, with it seeming the Greek world saw a greater conflict was on the horizon. We will turn to Thucydides for this part. In case of war, we should obviously be useful to you, but some of you think that there is no immediate danger of war. Those who think along these lines are deceiving themselves. They do not see the facts that Sparta is frightened of you and wants war, that Corinth is your enemy, and is also influential at Sparta. The delegates then continue with highlighting the dangers of Corinth in this situation. Corinth has attacked us first, in order to attack you afterwards. She has no wish to make enemies of us both at once, and find us standing together against her. What she wants is to get an initial advantage over you in one or two ways, either by destroying our power or by forcing us to use it in her interests. But it is our policy to be one move ahead, which is why we want you to accept the alliance which we offer. It is better to have the initiative in these matters. Thucydides spends pages detailing these speeches, but I think here we have the essence of the Corcyraeans' arguments for Athenian help. Before stepping down from addressing the Athenians, they would end by reinforcing their main point. The whole thing can be put very shortly, and these few words will give you the gist of the whole argument and why you should not abandon us. There are three considerable naval powers in Hellas: Athens, Corcyra, and Corinth. If Corinth gets control of us first, and you allow our navy to be united with hers, you will have to fight against the combined fleets of Corcyra and the Peloponnese. But if you receive us into your alliance, you will enter upon the war with our ships as well as your own. After hearing what the Corcyraeans had put forward, the Corinthian delegation now got up and addressed the Athenians, with them looking to counter the Corcyraeans' points. They would begin by addressing Corcyra's position of neutrality and their apparent naive belief this was to prevent them from becoming involved in others' evils. Here they would point out that this neutrality was to protect their own evil actions. By not being part of any league, they would be left to be their own judges. This policy, coupled with their geographical isolation, would see they were in a position to present the facts as they saw them, without many outsiders looking in at developments within Corcyra. They would also highlight the point that Corcyra was not a victim, and had a long history of disrespecting Corinth, their mother city. They believed this disrespect was unreasonable given that Corinth had good relations with all their other colonies and allies. Corcyra had also pointed out that they had attempted to put the matter to arbitration on a few occasions, this being a point to try and show Corinth's unreasonable actions in the matter. However, Corinth would address this when saying, they actually say that they were prepared in the first place to submit the matter to arbitration. The phrase is meaningless when used by someone who has already stolen an advantage and makes the offer from a safe position. It should only be used when, before opening hostilities, one puts oneself on a real and not artificial level with one's enemies. The Corinthians would then continue on to argue that Corcyra was not acting in Athens' interests, but only out of fear through their own wrongdoings. For this, they were now attempting to make Athens complicit in their current crimes against Epidamnus, a city they failed to help when they had come seeking their aid when in peril. Corinth would argue that Epidamnus was still tied to them, and for this reason they would come to their aid. It was only after this Corcyra would get involved by forcibly taking the city. They then pointed out that if Corcyra's intentions were just, they would have come seeking an alliance with the Athenians before the situation had developed. The delegates then turned to the legalities of an alliance with Corcyra, this referring to the clause within the 30 Years' Peace that allowed the different spheres to take in neutral powers as allies. On the face of it, this looked not to breach this clause, but Corinth would argue, this cannot refer to the cases where the object of joining an alliance is to injure other powers. It cannot refer to a case where a city is only looking for security because it is in revolt, and where the result of accepting its alliance, if one looks at the matter dispassionately, will be not peace but war. This then would see Corinth put forward that by Athens taking up a position of alliance with Corcyra, Corinth's enemy, this would also see Athens become an enemy by extension. This forcing hostilities with a city that has previously extended goodwill towards Athens. Here they were referring to the naval assistance that Corinth provided Athens before the Persian Wars, when Athens attacked Aegina, while they also spoke out against attacking Athens during the time that Athens was struggling with a siege at Thassos. To then round out their argument, the Corinthian delegates would end with the point of this so-called coming war the Corcyrians focused on. Thucydides would write, it is generally the best policy to make the fewest errors in judgment, and you must remember that, though Corcyra is trying to frighten you into doing wrong by this idea of a coming war, there is no certainty that war will come. He then continues, do not be influenced by the fact that they are offering you a great naval alliance. The power that deals fairly with its equals finds truer security, that one which is hurried into snatching some apparent but dangerous advantage. Both parties had now put their cases forward to Athens. It would now be discussed within the assembly to arrive at a decision. The representatives appeared to have remained in Athens for the coming result. They would need to wait for a while, as the matter would be debated at two separate assemblies. The first would see the Athenians favouring the Corinthian position, but by the second, a change in thinking had occurred, and the assembly voted to assist Corcyra. However, this was not to be a full alliance, but a limited one. It appears Athens had taken on board some of the points Corinth made. The alliance would not be in effect for any war either of them had on hand, Athens being careful around the provisions of the 30 Years' Peace. Instead, the alliance would be defensive in nature, would only come into effect if Athens, Corcyra, or any of their allies were attacked from outside. This decision by Athens would see the situation that had developed between Corcyra and Corinth around the issue of Epidamnus become more volatile than ever. Next episode, we will look deeper into Athens' decision to support Corcyra and then turn to the consequences and developments that would see the situation in the Greek world descend further towards a general Greek war. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution has truly helped me grow the series. I'd like to give a special mention to Linda Cox, Adam Toads, and Caroline Sinovitz for deciding to sign up and support the series over on Patreon. I hope you enjoyed the extra episodes. If you've also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated in what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 69, Pressure Builds.